Hello, good afternoon. I'm Liza Posas, the head of Research Services and Archives at the Autry Museum of the American West. First, I would like to acknowledge the traditional caretakers of this land, the Gabrielino Tongva people. I would also like to thank the Autry's generous donors and members for making this program happen. I'm honored, along with the Board of Trustees, to welcome you to the Artist Salons. Today's Artist Salon is associated with the newly opened exhibition, What's Her Story? Women in the Archives. This exhibit showcases the Assistance League of Los Angeles, Carolyn Boeing Poole, Gladys Knight Harris, Native Voices Theater Ensemble, and LA Women's March participants as 20th and 21st century women who documented their own activities and created an archive as a way to preserve a legacy in their own voice. Also featured are stories of Bertha Parker Cody, Manuela Garcia, Clara Forslund, and the focus of today's conversation, an unidentified woman whose lives were documented in archives made by other creators, such as friends, colleagues, government agencies, and other institutions and individuals who produce written and visual records. This exhibit also introduces the hands-on work of archivists that happens behind the scenes but are needed to bring the more hidden narratives to light. Archivists also rely on the work of expert researchers, historians, community members to amplify these voices. As already mentioned, the What's Her Story exhibit includes a photograph of an identified woman holding a baby noted as Hortense Bardasch, 6 months old. In an attempt to amplify the voice behind the unidentified woman in this image, we will discuss clues found on this item with genealogist Kenyatta D. Berry. Kenyatta is a contributor to the groundbreaking 1619 project published by the New York Times. She is the 2019 Honorary Chair for Preservation Week and was recently named a newsmaker in American Libraries Magazine, a publication of the American Library Association. Kenyatta is an author, attorney, lecturer, professional genealogist, and host of PBS's show, Genealogy Roadshow. Kenyatta's vast knowledge in African American genealogy, enslaved ancestral research, and DNA has made her an invaluable go-to source for information from all parts of the world. As demand grows for people to learn more about their lineage and DNA, Kenyatta continues to innovate, transforming the world of genealogy by making it more accessible to the masses. Before we go any further or much further, I would like to mention that if you do have any questions during any point of our conversation, to please enter them at any time in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. So let me begin by telling you a little bit about the physical exhibit. When entering the What's Her Story exhibit, visitors will be met with this title wall. Once you get past the title wall, the physical exhibit takes you on a journey from the largest to smallest archive collection and displays how the quantity of evidence available affects the telling of historical narratives or narrative. Where this photo is displayed, though, is in the title wall. Given this exhibit is somewhat in the round, this photograph begins as well as punctuates the exhibit experience in the hopes that the question, what's her story, and how one thinks about answering it gets somewhat transformed from when they first entered the exhibit to when they exit the exhibit. I'm very much looking forward to this conversation with Kenyatta in her research journey and connection to this photo. And Kenyatta, on behalf of myself personally and the Autry, thank you for joining us for this artist salon. And
Thank you for
again,
having me.
if you have any questions during our conversation, please enter them at any time in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom window. The Autry Museum of the American West represents something slightly different to each of you who visits us physically and virtually. For me, in conjunction with the honoring of the 100th anniversary of women winning the right to vote, What's Her Story? Women in the Archives reveals compelling stories of women found in the Autry's collections and signify one of our greatest defining strengths of our institution. I just want to share first again a little bit more about the exhibit. Each of the stories within the exhibit has an archive issue. And the archive issue associated with the photograph we'll be talking about is also explained in one of the video segments created for this exhibit, which we will play now in order to get us started.
Archivists are like detectives in the sense that they're inquisitive. There always seems to be open questions out there about the collection. Like, who is this person who made it? What was their life like? What was their environment? Why was this made? Why was it saved? And how can we weave not only their stories together from these pieces of evidence that are interesting and dynamic, but then lay that story to the rest of the world of what was going on at the time. So it stitches this narrative together that can be very microscopic and look at one item or one place in time, but then as you learn more, you also want to learn at the macro view of things to inform each other. For instance, the detective work involved in getting to know more about the Assistance League of Los Angeles, which was a philanthropic group that started in Los Angeles 100 years ago by Anne Banning and Ada Laughlin and a dozen other women who really wanted to give back to the community. But then I had to ask myself, if this organization is 100 years old and they did so much great work, especially for mothers and children, why haven't I known these stories from before? In wanting to find out more information about the Assistance League of Los Angeles, I looked within the archives to see what kind of records they kept, which was great. So they had photograph and scrapbooks and reports and publications, but then I also had to look outside of the collection, such as newspaper clippings or other archival collections held across town. That is part of the detective work whenever you take in any collection. You look firstly within to describe it, but then you also try to see how it was described using outside sources, how outside sources also documented their history and activities.
Thank you, Rob, for playing that. And that's like a bonus video, but once you see the video, you'll see that there's going to be, I explained the various clues about the image, but there's also other information that we provided Kenyatta, and that is the genealogical information of the baby, Hortense Bardasch, which was done by a relative who wanted to who did their own genealogical research in 2009. So what we know about the baby, Hortense Bardasch, is that the last name is spelled various ways. It could be Bardasch with a C, or Bardasch, like bar and dash, or a German spelling, which is Bardasch, I guess, Bardaszz. Hortense's father was Adam Bardasch, and he was the youngest son of Dr. Stephen Herman. And Dr. Stephen Herman was born in Poland in the early 1800s. And this relative believes that they had Jewish roots somewhere in Europe. And that he also immigrated to New Orleans, Louisiana in 1834. So Adam Bardasch presumably was there, part of the family in the early to mid 1800s. And then later on, he married Mara or Mary Antoinette. Of course, I think of Marie Antoinette, but that's the first and middle name. The maiden name is unknown. And that also, one last clue, that also the father was in Galveston, Texas as early as 1871, and he was part of the Civil War. He served in Company B, Unit 5 in the Texas Cavalry for the Confederate Army. So here we are with the video more about the image.
There's no such thing as being unbiased in the archives. There's always a sense of bias. The bias in archives is connected with what is preserved and what is kept, and also what is cared for, and therefore made accessible for the public and researchers to look at. One of the things that archivists have been concentrating as of late is where are the silences in the archives and where are the lost narratives in the archives. So one example is the photograph that we have of Hortense Bardasch. The photograph shows a caretaker holding a baby. The baby is Hortense Bardasch, and she was identified and also was given the age of 6 months. But the African-American caretaker that's carrying her is not identified. All the clues that we have to go on are on that piece. However, not all is lost. There are some clues there. We can use the identity of Bardasch to look up her family history and her location, thinking that maybe the caretaker traveled with them. We also have, from knowing the age that she was from the photograph, we know that the photograph was dated in 1876, as well as that it was taken in Texas. So that gives us leads in looking at genealogical resources, census data, and city directories to find out more about the unidentified woman. Although we might have archival collections of a predominantly upper class institution, it's not to say that there's other stories within there. So it takes a commitment and it takes hands on the archives to find these varied stories that do strive to bring about a more inclusive and a more dynamic narrative. My hope is that during this exhibit, we'll be able to look at some of these resources I mentioned to hopefully get closer to answering the particular question of who is this woman in this photograph and what is her story.
Excellent. So with all of that, so you've got the genealogical research done about Hortense and the clues that are on the photograph. So the first question before we get into the conversation about the image itself, how do you prepare yourself for this type of research?
Great question. So in genealogy, one of the biggest things is to sort of start with yourself. What information do you know, right? And then start to use different family members or other resources to fill in those gaps. And then you really get to sort of, well, what's the question? What am I trying to find, right? And in this particular situation, the unidentified woman, right? So with that, all the items you mentioned, the census records, the city directories as well, are really important in doing this research. It's very challenging to do African-American genealogy. It's very challenging to find women when you're doing research. So it's really important to narrow your focus and also be able to get small wins, as I call them, right? If you find someone in a record, be excited about it. If you don't be discouraged. So it's really about starting with yourself, interviewing family, identifying the problem, and using those resources to help craft that story.
Great. And Rob, can you put up the image of the woman? Kenyatta, when we first talked, you and
Mhm.
I did a good deep dive in just this image. In my field or the librarian field, we call it information or visual literacy, which is kind of an interesting phrasing, but it's just basically examining images itself and what you can get from that. So could you talk about what you paid attention to or what called out to you when looking at this image?
Yeah, the first thing that kind of stood out for me was her clothing. You know, she's very well dressed, very kind of, poised, and it's not um a picture where you kind of see that there's a relationship there as a caretaker of Hortense, but it's not a relationship as a family member, if that makes sense. And I will use an example from when we were on Genealogy Roadshow. We had a very similar photo of an African American man and a probably a 2-year old um, white child, male. And you could tell by looking at both of them, they were smiling. You could tell that intimacy between them. He had his hand around him, around his neck as he was holding him. And here, this seems to be very staged to me. And when we first started discussing this, I kind of thought she was much older, um, thinking she might have been 18 or 20. But as I continued to examine the photo, she looks much younger to me. So those are a couple of things that really stood out for me.
And then where did you go from here? So you have this information, and like we presented, there are challenges. So you have the photo. Then where did your journey lead you to?
So, and it was quite a journey. So when you're there, right, you mentioned the census records. You mentioned we dated it to 1876, which for a census is unfortunate for genealogists because that falls right in between census years of 1870 and 1880. And so what I did is I said, let me learn more about African Americans in Galveston. Let me learn more, taking the genealogical information, let me learn more about Hortense and her father, Adam. What was he doing? Where were they living? So I did a lot of research on them. Then the other part was, how do I narrow it down? Right? I have no name. The other photo I just talked about in referencing this, using as a reference, there was a name on that. We don't have a name for her. So I had to really try to identify African Americans in the Galveston community that possibly could have been living around them, that could have been listed as either maids or servants, you name it, right? And then had to really guess her age range as well, because I was not able to find her in the household with Hortense's family at all. Right in 1880, Hortense and her sister and her mom went to, I believe it was Wyoming County or in New York to visit their family. But Adam remained elusive, her father. He was in the city directories, right? But for some reason, he wasn't in the 1880 census. And if they're gone and visiting 1880, they did not pay for her to travel with them. Okay. So for me, it became finding a needle in a haystack, really was the issue. So in trying to identify the unidentified woman, one of the things I want to kind of stress to the folks that are listening to this is, although you may be discouraged at first, right, because you can't really find your person, there are ways in which you can still look for them and to keep looking for them. And so with this particular photo, now it becomes for me a study of African Americans in Galveston after the Civil War and during Reconstruction. What did that look like? What were their lives like? Right. And that is a much broader study, but it helps in doing genealogical research because it allows you to understand the area that you're researching, which will help give you clues to your family. Spoiler alert, with her, it was very difficult and I was not, given the time frame, able to identify her. However, I am so excited to have this conversation with you today because she gets this exposure. Someone may be watching this, someone may know Galveston, they may know African Americans there, they may have heard of the Bardasch name. And now she's no longer just a woman sitting in the collection.
Mm-hmm.
Even though we don't know her name now, we may know her name later. And I'm excited to just even give her this opportunity to be seen.
Yeah, I feel the same way. That was one of the things that I had meant to look at, but this was a purchase. How the Autry came to get this photograph, it was a purchase that the Autry bought some time ago, I think sometime in the 80s. And that's it. It was just this singular purchase. So there was really nothing wrapped around it. And I felt like, that there was a chance that we would not be able to find more information about this woman. But then, looking that this is a studio portrait,
Mm-hmm.
and we can identify the photographers Blessing and Brothers in Texas. Can you talk a little bit about sort of it being the characteristic of being a studio portrait and what that means for this particular photographer or photographer studio to have a space to create these types of images, or to have these images come in as a client?
Mm-hmm. There are a lot of these images that are out there, right? That are studio photos of children with their African American caretakers, right? They arise, whether, like you said, you guys purchased it in the 80s. The one I mentioned earlier was a studio photo as well that was kept within the family and then kind of passed down. These types of images are around. And it's great to identify the studio. It's great to kind of do the reference, or excuse me, research on Blessing and Brothers. But what happens, and what I have seen, and when clients come to me, even I have unidentified photos, unidentified individuals in my own collection, is that unfortunately it was more about Hortense, or it was more about the other, the white child, than it was about the African American caretaker. And these photos are really to commemorate the child's life and not commemorate the caretaker's life, right? So that makes it very difficult.
And given what you know with this historical context, and could you talk a little bit about the meaningfulness of the year? I know that there is a brick wall
Mhm.
in regards to this research. Could you talk about like the importance, or of the time in which this photo was taken?
Sure. So it was taken in 1876. So where we are right now, or where we were then, excuse me, in 1876 when the photo was taken, there was I guess, controversial, maybe is the word, presidential election, and a compromise that we were like at the end of Reconstruction. This particular time in history is when the troops left the South, right? So they pulled out of the South. So now for African Americans during that time, all of the rights, all of the privileges, all of the things that we were promised, or the formerly enslaved were promised, are being taken away, or had been taken away. And so now you're going right into the Jim Crow era. So there's a lot of uncertainty at this time, in Texas and all over the South and in the country. So being able to have a job, or as a caretaker, or be employed, these were kind of the things that we had to do. These are only opportunities available to African Americans. And that's why when I mentioned her look, the stare, the way she holds Hortense, this is not, in my opinion, you don't get an intimate relationship between those two. And that's probably because we were in the midst of upheaval right after the end of slavery. And as far as the brick wall, because you did mention that, I will mention the
Yeah.
1870 brick wall. I'm so into Reconstruction right now. It's like my big thing. But the 1870 brick wall is basically, 1870 was the first federal census where the formerly enslaved were enumerated. And what that meant is those 4 million were counted. They were counted as uh, human beings. They were counted with their names and their ages and their race, whether they were Black or mulatto. And what happens is that a lot of African Americans go from 1940 to 1870, but they can't get any further than that, right? So we call it the 1870 brick wall. And why I mentioned Reconstruction is because there are a lot of ways to get over that 1870 brick wall. And one of the things I tried to do in doing this research as well, that I did not mention earlier, is look for records related to the Freedmen's Bureau. So the Freedmen's Bureau was established March 3rd, 1865. And the Freedmen's Bureau basically had labor contracts, they had education, they had schools, they had all these different things that, kind of to rebuild the South and integrate African Americans into society. So when finding the unidentified woman in Galveston, is maybe I can come at this and find, what the African Americans were doing, what was their life like during that time period. And if you're doing genealogical research, Freedmen's Bureau records are the way to get over that 1870 brick wall.
Excellent. And so with that question, or with this information, do you think information about her is out there somewhere?
I do think information about her is is out there somewhere. I absolutely do. It could be information that is contained, in someone's, maybe even it's another genealogist researching a Hortense's family. It could be information that's contained in a book or something about African Americans in Galveston, what their jobs, their roles were like. But one of the challenges in doing research, at least I have found in my own family, are photographs. I have some photographs. I haven't identified the people and I'm related to them. And then, how do you really go back, and how do people preserve photographs in African American families? And where do those photographs go? Because again, Hortense is the person that is the focus of this. So the photograph will more likely reside with her family. But I do feel there are ways for us to continue to look for information about her.
And there's a question from the audience, do you know of any online database or collection where individuals can search photos like the one shown?
I would go to, I don't know of anything genealogical related. What I mean by that, outside of something like the Library of Congress, or looking at, probably if you want to focus on photographs in a specific area, to find your ancestor or relative, I would say number one, look in the state and or county where your ancestor lived. And when you go to that county, I'll use an example for my family, Culpeper County, Virginia, right? So I would go to the Culpeper Historical Society to look for stuff. I would search at the Library of Virginia to look for photos. I would then try to see, is there a genealogical society that's collecting photos? Because a lot of societies are scanning photos from people. So those are the types of things that I would do if you're looking for individuals in your area. A lot of photos also are available if you want to just collect photos and try to find people or interested in it. A lot of photos are available on eBay. I mean, I have people contact me all the time. They purchased this photo in the exact same incident we're in right now. We have the studio's name. We know who the child or whomever is in the photo, but we know nothing about the African-American person. And I've already looked up the studio. So what's next, right? And that's when you start the real hard work.
Yeah, so you mentioned exposure. Like, we have this platform to get the image out there that maybe somebody would be able to help with the identification of it. And this research, we can now make a note of this research that was done, and we have the exhibit. But it is problematic in the sense that it does definitely show a power dynamic. It's, one of those, I could say maybe a common image that shows a controversial power dynamic or a paradigm of a history in U.S. history that, is not quite puts America in the best light. And then we don't have any identification. So institutions like us, we have that titled Unidentified Woman and Hortense Bardasch, which is not, maybe the best title, but how would you go about bridging, like, helping people find this image and explaining this image so it comes up in a search, even though there's no identity attached to the woman?
Yeah. So I would, even though you have an unidentified woman or man or African-American person in the photo, obviously the location, right, would be a big one. Presumed occupation could be one. Because as I mentioned, when I did that search, when I literally was searching in the census records in Galveston, trying to figure out which way, how I'm going to slice and dice this data, it was really around, okay, how is she going to be identified, right? When we look at the 1870 census, estimating her age, how is she being identified? In 1870, you're listed with an occupation. But if you're living in a household with someone, you may be listed as a servant, you may be listed as a maid, you may be listed as a cook, or maybe a caretaker, right? So she could have been all of those. at that point. We don't know how much money they had. We don't know if they had a large staff of folks that they, employ. We know nothing about their financial piece, right? So how do I identify or kind of amplify these photos so that if someone's searching, is you have to look at all those different characteristics and tags. And also, adding Hortense to the photo as well is important, and her whole family, because there's probably more people looking, unfortunately, for Hortense and the Bardasch family, and they are for the African American woman, just because they don't probably even know this photo exists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And the person that was a descendant of Hortense who did the genealogy, it's interesting. He was looking for his Jewish relatives that immigrated to the United States from Poland. So he wasn't able to make his connection. He just knew that the last name, everybody with that last name is likely related. So he had to go on his own journey. Got another question. I love these questions that say dream in here. What is your dream for archives in the context of community access and holistic history? What could archives mean to social movements? So I think those are two good questions. So I'll repeat the first one. What is your dream for archives in the context of community access and holistic history? Thank you for that phrasing, Jenny. Holistic history.
So my dream for community access is, I have such a dream for archives anyway. There's so much I want. But, my dream would be being able to digitize, let me say this, take those collections that have been stored away, those collections that really don't see the light. And a lot of those collections, taking those collections, making them accessible, whether it's by digitizing them, by featuring them like you guys are doing, but also educating. Here's the thing about this, right? We've been talking about the process of how do you find these people? How do you do the genealogy research and all of that? Not everyone knows how to do that. Right. And, I've been doing it for 20 years and I'm still learning every day. Okay. I make the same basic mistakes everyone makes. So if I am reaching out to the community, then it is really important, for that holistic healing, I think was the phrase that was used, to educate them on how to use this and why it's important for them. Right. These types of things change people's lives. I've seen it happen in front of me. And my dream would be for everyone to be able to have that life-changing moment, for everyone to be able to find their people, connect with their people. And if I can find someone I'm related to in an archive because you've opened up the archive to me, that is really my dream.
Have you found, I'm going to squeeze in this question. Have you found challenges to that, to the access? And maybe, I don't want you to call out anybody, but maybe there's some issues that you see across the board in archives regarding access, because let's face it, right? The idea of archives came from a particular person had to be of a particular status to access it, particular status to even save the material. So what are the challenges you've come across?
Yeah, the challenges, I would say I have come across all of those things, right? You think about the social, the economic pieces of it, but really in the area that I focus on, especially with African-American and slave genealogy, it's the challenge of wanting to bring that out. Do I really want to bring out and display, a bill of sale or a plantation book that lists human beings with a value attached to them? How will that impact my board? How will that impact my donors? How will that impact the family who provided me with that object? Right?
Yeah.
And that is what I have seen across the board be an issue. And that's the thing that is important for me, because that's what we need the most access to help us find our people. That is what we need. So hiding it kind of sweeping that history under the rug because you don't want to talk about it, is just one of those things. So I would say that that's been the challenge, is really trying to avoid bringing out that negative history.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Hopefully we've the royal we of history tellers and archive tellers and interpreter, that there is, people can start to lean into that, because I am seeing that more and more as a critical history of their own institution, and maybe people could follow suit. There is a question again about the photography studio, and it being a portrait, a formal studio. Did you in particular, so I think we discussed this early on, but did you in particular look at the Blessing and
Yeah,
Brother?
thank you. I did look at them, but what I stopped myself from going, seriously, and this is for the person with the question, I apologize, I don't have like a entire genealogy on them. But one of the things that you do when you're doing genealogies, I looked at Blessing and Brothers photographers for a bit, but then I kind of I was going down a rabbit hole, right? And I wanted to spend my time looking for the unidentified woman, because so many times, we just focusing on them may not have fully told her story. And here's why. Because given the time frame that we were in 1876, the state of the country, going into Jim Crow, just being in Texas, I'm just very doubtful that I would have found her through them. I did think about that and started to do that research, but I realized it would be better for me to spend my time looking at the African Americans or trying to dissect the census records, trying to look at cities directories. And another thing about city directories I want to mention, depending on where you are with the city directory, sometimes, the African Americans are listed in the back of the city directory. Sometimes they're listed in the city directory, but have an asterisk. So you really have to understand where you're searching and researching to find out. And then also, again, it's like finding a needle in a haystack. So a long answer to no, I didn't want to go down the rabbit hole with them, but I can understand the question. It seems like it should work.
Research that you've done has looking at the photographic studios helped you out in other cases?
It is not. A lot of times the photographs, what really helps us are, kind of questioning the family. Right? Have you heard any family stories, any oral history? Oh, I've heard about, Aunt so-and-so, or whatever term they would use that we would use today to describe someone. When I mentioned with the one with Uncle Fate, he was known as Uncle Fate. His name wasn't Fate. His name was Lafayette, but that was his nickname. But we had that one little thing. That's all we had. But with that one little piece, we were able to find more information about him. So the studio led us to nothing. So I would say if you have these types of photographs, yes, you want to know about the studio. Yes, you want to kind of know about the area. You want to know about the person that is identified, but you also want to know about the community, about the Black community that's in that area, right? Because those are the folks that were taking care of the kids for the families that could afford it.
Another question is about that I did ask, but we didn't really get to, is like social movements. Where do archives play in regards to social movements?
So archives play a big role in as I mentioned, taking those things that are in the back, kind of hidden, put away. We don't bring those out, bringing those forward in exhibits, bringing those forward in webinars, talking about them. I think who does a great job, and just because my family's from Virginia, so I always reference Virginia, but the Library of Virginia has something called Virginia Untold, and they really took, and I think that was the original name, may have changed now, but they really have taken the African-American records that they have and pull them out and put them on display, and they highlight them in their blog. They transcribe those records. So what archives can do to help with this kind of social justice is get our stories out there. The reason you're seeing all of this stuff, blow up like it is because you're trying to hide the history. We know it. Everybody else needs to know it, right? And we're trying to learn more about our people. So if you want to be active and proactive in social justice, allow us access to the archives, allow our folks and their stories to be told, highlight our stories, because Black history is American history. And highlight the stories of those, also American Indian history. I mean, they're part of our history. Everything, everyone contributed something to the building of the United States. But for those things that are painful for us, those stories you don't want to talk about, you have to really bring those out as an archivist, if you're really into social justice, because anybody can put out a statement, but where's your action?
Yeah, that's actually a really great point. There was a lot of conversations about, where people's footing is, and I think it can be difficult. I know I'm speaking vague terms, but I feel that it is, in one sense, we are discussing, a lot of discussion is around reconciliation, reparative work, transparency, inclusivity, and acknowledgements of all kinds. And so, and finding exactly where you stand in that and how you want to express yourself, and how in your institution, how it wants to express itself too during that discourse. A bit of feeling around. One of the other questions that kind of touches upon this is the idea of decolonization. So I don't know if you've heard it, but definitely in the museum world, we've heard the phrase decolonize the museum, decolonize the archives, decolonize like basically cultural institutions that have started with, sort of, I guess, an elitist role. So have you been part of those conversations? Have you been privy or have any sort of comments in regards to where museums at large, where they can play in decolonizing, or even the Autry in decolonizing what's traditional museum, let's say?
Right. I have not been part of those conversations, but I do feel museums are one of my favorite things, right? So anywhere I go in the world, I always go to a museum. It doesn't matter, and but I feel like, and I haven't heard that kind of phrase being used in the genealogical world, obviously, but I will answer the question in this way, hopefully. And if I don't answer it, you can ask it a different way if I don't. Museums are like, make yourself inclusive, welcoming, right? If I see a beautiful museum because I'm interested as that's just Kenyatta, I'm going to say, hey, I'm going to walk into this museum, right? Someone who might not be have the same level of interest as I do, may see the museum as a space that's not made for them. And so what they do is they don't go at all. And what you need to do, especially in your community, right? I'm from Detroit, so, in the community, you need to give those folks the ability to say, hey, we want you to be here. We want you to show up. We want you to, and when you get here, we're actually going to tell your stories, or stories that you can relate to. Because one of the things that matters so much is representation. If I walk in somewhere and I don't see anything that looks like me, there's not any, any photographs or any art or anything by anyone that is, that's like me, then I'm going to think that this is not a place that I belong. This is not a place where I can come and I can access and, and do things. And also the other thing is price, as far as what it costs to enter the museum, right? Not everyone is free like the Smithsonian. So really, how does that play into it? How does education play into it? How do you get those kids in the inner city schools to understand that art is something they can do? This is something that a museum is a place that they belong. And so working towards that as a goal, as we talked about social justice, let that be a small part of it, right? Because you know, a
Mm.
lot of things you can't do because of boards. I get that. I'm a business person. I get that. Sometimes you can't just, you know, you want to run out and bring out, let me show this, you know, schedule here. And they're like, no, people get offended or whatever. So you can't do everything. But being able to say, let us at least let these students know, these children know, this community know that they're welcome here. And it's maybe just having a one night for them, maybe have an educational program for them. And that, I think, is a way in which you can start to bring people back into the museum. And then they'll start to ask the questions. And if the community starts to say, well, why don't I see anyone that looks like me? I would come here more often, or I'd be interested. I tell my friends or my family or whomever, if I saw that, then those are things that you can take to the leaders at the institution, at the museum, and say, look, we have a demand for this. But if you don't make it accessible to us, then, or accessible not just to me, but, you know, to anyone, it's both, it's not only, it's a social, economic issue, right? You know, if I don't, you know, if I feel like only rich people go to the museum, then I'm going to think, why would I even walk in there? So change that narrative.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Instead of, you know, focusing on this huge complex issue of social justice and even decolonization, it's like make it comfortable for the community with which you like to reflect and serve.
Yes.
Great. So I was asked a couple of questions in relation to archives, but I want to insert a different, instead of archives, because one of the questions I got is, why do you go into archives work, and what, and how is it meaningful to you? I guess and it says for me, but I would like to give you the opportunity for you to answer that question, because I'm feeling, based on our previous conversations, I might just end up saying ditto after I hear your response. So I'll change it to, why did you go into genealogical work, and what about it is meaningful for you?
Well, I went into genealogical work because, you know, I started doing research when I was in law school. It wasn't on my own family. It was from my ex-boyfriend's family. I loved it. It was a break from torts and contracts law, and it was fantastic, right? So I was like, good, I'm not looking for something else. But, you know, once I started to do it, I really felt like, and I always say, I didn't find the work found me. And what I'm talking about there is I'm really focusing on enslaved genealogy, right? You can, when you're doing genealogical work, you can pick any specialty you want. Military, you can do, you know, whatever your area might be. You may want to do immigration naturalization records. For me personally, it has been the sheer pleasure and rewarding feeling of when I help someone find their person, you know, is sort of like to the point of why I kind of why I went into it. And I want to give folks a voice that have been forgotten, you know. And when you dig someone out of an archive, when you bring out a book, a plantation record, and there's a list of enslaved individuals that probably haven't seen, you know, this book hasn't seen the light of day in 70 years or something or whatever, you're able to say, hey, I see you as a human being. I don't see you as a piece of property. And so that was really the reason why I went into it, because I really felt like, you know, it's my job and my goal to give voices to those, you know, to try to tell their story, who have been forgotten. And it's been very, very rewarding work. And my, you know, I was working full time in technology and left my job in 2017 to focus on this. And I think I had experiences on the show that I was like, this is so much more rewarding than selling HR software. So I'm going to go and do this. Okay. Instead, because I can see I'm actually helping people and changing their lives. So that's the reason. But there's a second question I didn't answer.
Oh, and I think you did. It's like, why
Okay.
did you go into genealogy work, and what about it is meaningful to you? So,
Yeah. Yeah. It's just like, I think it's, yeah, it's the meaningful part really is telling those stories. And, you know, I get to do what I love and I'm passionate about. And that for me is, it's rewarding for me too. It's very hard work, but that makes me feel like I'm at least doing something to make the world a better place.
Yeah, that's great. And in regards to how I would answer that question as an archivist, and when I went to archive work, there's a lot of parallels there. The work did find me. A lot of archivists say it's like I'm an archivist because it's a calling, which may or may not be taken in like a good light. But honestly, I feel that it was something that I started doing while working another job and thought like, this is it. This is what I want to do. And it did relate to telling story and representation. And from my personal experiences of not seeing things represented as I was growing up, and like, representation means so much to those who don't see it growing up. We did another talk last week about mixtapes
Mm.
and of mixtapes, and we were talking about what our walk-on songs were, and my walk-on song was Rhythm Nation by Janet Jackson, and it because of the music video, and I froze when I saw the music video. And even though I'm not of the African American community, she was the closest that looked like me on TV when I was growing up, and like the way that she danced, the way that she moved, the way that she put represented herself, I just felt akin to it. And when you see representation, you get a sense of belonging, importance in your history, and confidence. So yeah, I got into archives because I'm like, dude, archives are everywhere, and there
Right.
may be all kinds of communities. So let's bring them up to the surface. So
Absolutely.
very similar in that. A simpler question is, what do you think the chances are of finding more photographs of Hortense with maybe more clues of the African American woman or others that they could have been on in the same household?
Yeah. So when it comes to photographs like this, right, as I mentioned earlier, when I've had similar ones, finding more clues and kind of, to take a broader stroke here, um, continuing to search for her, right? That's the bigger question. Identifying this woman. What can we do to continue that search, right? We've talked about going down the rabbit hole of looking at the studio. And then it's like, okay, maybe they might have taken a few other photos, but we're not real sure if they took photos of, if they took another photo of an African American caretaker and a baby, that those two were related, right? Then you think about, okay, well, let me look at the city directories. Let me try to kind of really navigate and map out what Black Galveston looked like, what that neighborhood looked like, what those their occupations, as well as the census records, right? So to find more photos and to maybe to help identify her. The photos, unfortunately, will be the collection of the Bardasch family, or maybe a different collection. When I try to find more information about an individual, typically, I search a lot of archives, right, online. And when you're doing African American genealogy, you have to find out more about whether it's the enslaver, so the enslaved family, the enslaved family enslaving your ancestors, or in this situation, you have to find out information about the white family, because that's where your ancestor is tied. I know more about the Bardasch family, Bardasch family than I do her, right? And more about what they were doing, even just in my own research. I mean, I even created a tree for them on Ancestry as I was prepping for this salon, right? And hoping to see if I could get enough on Adam, the father, that I could get the city directory stuff, that I can get all of this to paint a portrait of his life, to see where she and her family might have intersected. But, those photos, to answer the question, will probably be in the collection of the white family, or maybe some other archive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And that is one of the points that we do try to make in the exhibit, as well as the media pieces, is that there are there are narratives to be had, but they might be in between and within and throughout an archive of a different person or a different entity.
Mhm.
So, and that's what I think archives are grappling with and what they're calling reparative work, these reparative narratives, where it just doesn't talk about the collector or the creator, but all the different people that they came in contact with, and,
Mhm.
other associations and relationships.
Mhm.
Um, this might be our last question. It's a very good one. It's about African American newspapers,
Mhm.
and how you can use African American newspapers to research the stories like the caregiver. And if we don't have the name, what are the other terms we can use based on the clues, like the ones in the photo?
So African American newspapers, there are actually two books that, of course, I'm not going to remember the names of them right now, but there are actually two books that have that discuss kind of all the African American newspapers. But what you can do today is if you go online to the Library of Congress, they have something called Chronicling America, and it's
Mm.
they actually have a list. At least I've seen, from what I believe, a list of all of the newspapers um, I think ever published, right? They have a certain time frame. They have some online and it's free. You can search for those. You can also, when you go there, you can search by state and you can search for African American newspapers. Okay. Now, in African American newspapers, what information are you going to find? Very similar to other stuff that you find, right? You're going to have the gossip of the day, you're going to have the obituaries, you're going to have all of that information. So, what the newspaper would help you do is, again, learn more about that community. But when you're looking for someone, what other terms could you use? As I mentioned before, she could have been enlisted as a maid, as a servant, as a cook, as a caregiver. I don't think they were using nanny. I haven't seen that. So, but there could have been, you just don't know. And also, one thing, I want to make a point. I think you mentioned at the top of when we started this discussion, there's no guarantee that she was actually living with them either.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the other part of it, right? That's the thing. I mean, that would have been a jackpot. We would have very different Salon had I found her living with them and we're like, look at this document. It's great. No, but if they're not, that's why I say all these other things are things that you need to do in understanding the community. And newspapers are a great way to start. They do have photos, but more than likely also in the newspaper, African American newspapers, they would talk about what was going on in the community, especially at this time, as it relates to Reconstruction ending and then going into Jim Crow.
Great. I'll go ahead and take this last question. We are about to, we're 2 minutes out, but there was a question about what role could the Autry play in making dreams come true. I think you've talked a lot, Kenyatta, about like just making the space open and representative, and having people feel like they have a stake in this. They're part of this. They belong there. For me, and I've been staying throughout the exhibit, is a hands on the archives, which is different from what you might think, especially an exhibit where you can't touch anything. But having hands on the archives by the people who preserve them and work with them and manage them, and those who research them, the more hands and exposure you have in the archives, the
Mm-hmm.
more you find out. And knowing that there's some practicalities, there's a lot of hours and labor and love of labor, but for me to make dreams come true is to be able to negotiate that, like to
Right,
have
right.
consistent hands on the archive safely, but also fruitfully. um, you know but yeah, that's what I'm gonna, that's how I phrase it. Hands on the archives. Let's just get it out there, and not have people be afraid to come in, like you were saying. Make it like it's open to you, more hospitality. So Kenyatta, I just want to say thank you for joining us today for Autry Artist Salons. And thank you all for your questions and your presence and being here. I do hope you get to see the physical exhibit. Somebody did ask, what goes on at the Autry Archives, which is located in the Resources Center in Burbank. But to see what we do, to see the behind the scenes work that my colleagues do, please if you can, visit the physical exhibit or go online to see the exhibit online. And it will also describe other things that's done behind the scenes. And thank you all for again taking time to hear about what happens when we uncover women's stories and the discovery of multiple stories that are attached to that. I do want to mention upcoming salons on Wednesday, May 19th. Please join my colleague, Karima Richardson, who is the Associate Curator of Archaeology and Osteology, for her second installment on archaeology stewardship. And she will highlight the Southwest Museum collection. And you could register at the autry.org/artists salons, both plurals. And thank you again.